The afternoon Jennie Crawford stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Nevada. The year was 1883, and she had exactly $4.32 to her name, a leather satchel containing every accounting ledger she had ever kept, and a letter of employment from a man she had never met. The town was smaller than the advertisement had made it sound, which was saying something because the advertisement had been modest to begin with. A single main street of packed red dirt ran between two rows of buildings, a general store, a livery, a hotel that listed slightly to the left as though tired from years of standing, a saloon with a painted sign that had faded so completely the name was anyone's guess, a barber shop, and a building at the far end whose shingle read simply, Wells Cattle and Trade. That was the place she was looking for. Jennie smoothed the front of her gray traveling dress, adjusted the pin at her collar, and picked up her bag. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, green-eyed, and possessed of the kind of steady composure that came not from privilege but from practice. She had been steadying herself since she was 15, when her father had lost the family accounting firm in Memphis to a card game and a bottle of whiskey, and she had taken over keeping the books for their creditors just to put food on the table. She had learned numbers the way some people learn to swim, by being thrown into deep water. The job posting had found her in Carson City, where she had been keeping books for a merchant who had just decided to close his shop and move his family to San Francisco. The posting was simple: bookkeeper needed, cattle and trade operation, Dusty Creek, Nevada, fair wages, references required, contact N. Wells. She had written her letter of inquiry, listed her references, and sent it without much hope. A week later, a reply had come in a spare, clean handwriting that told her more about the man than he probably intended. He needed someone honest. He needed someone who knew the difference between what a business looked like on paper and what it actually was. He would pay her room and board in addition to her wage. She should arrive by the 1st of June. It was June 2nd. The stage had been delayed. She walked the length of the main street with her chin up, noting the stares from the men on the boardwalk, with the same quiet acknowledgement she had given such stares her entire adult life. A woman walking into a business establishment alone in 1883 was still a point of considerable public interest in a town like Dusty Creek. She pushed open the door of Wells Cattle and Trade. The front room was larger than the exterior suggested. A wide pine counter ran along one wall, behind which stood shelves of ledgers and supply catalogs. A map of Nevada and the surrounding territories was pinned to the opposite wall with such precision that she felt a small, involuntary rush of professional respect. 3 chairs sat near a cold iron stove. The whole room smelled of leather and pine resin and something faintly like coffee. The man behind the counter was not what she expected. He was tall, she registered that first, even though he was partly bent over a ledger, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual work and not from posturing. Dark brown hair that needed cutting by a week or so, worn without a hat indoors. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with a jaw that was clean-shaved and a face that was weather-tanned in the particular way of men who spent more time outdoors than in. He wore a plain flannel shirt, dark trousers, and working boots. Nothing about him was decorative. He looked up when the door opened, and his eyes were a particular shade of gray-brown that she would later decide she had never seen before on another person. "Miss Crawford," he said, and his voice was even unhurried, like a man who had learned long ago that there was no advantage to raising it. "Mr. Wells," she said, "I apologize for the day's delay. The stage was held up past Reno." "I know," he said. "I heard from the livery master this morning. I am glad you arrived safe." He came around the counter and extended his hand, and she shook it once firmly, which seemed to satisfy him. "Let me show you where you will be staying, and then you can eat something. The work will keep until morning." That was the beginning. Jennie's room was above the trade office, accessible by a side staircase. It was small but clean. A bed with a proper iron frame and a quilt that looked handmade, a washstand with a white pitcher, a window that faced east, and a small writing desk that had been positioned so the light would fall across it correctly in the morning. She stood at that window and looked out at the darkening Nevada sky and thought, whoever set this desk here was thinking about the person who would use it. Nelson Wells, she would learn, was a man of almost no wasted words and a great deal of quiet, considered action. He had built his cattle and trade operation over 8 years, starting with a small herd of longhorns he had driven up from Texas at the age of 24, and a loan from a bank in Carson City that he had repaid in full 2 years ahead of schedule. He now ran 400 head across 3 grazing parcels, traded cattle at market in Reno twice yearly, and also maintained a supply trade with 3 smaller ranches in the surrounding county who depended on his purchasing power to get goods at reasonable prices. He employed a foreman named Hector Reyes, 3 cowhands, a cook named Margaret, and now a bookkeeper. He needed a bookkeeper, he explained to Jennie on that first morning over coffee in the small back office, because his current system was a disaster. She looked at the ledgers he set in front of her and did not say what she was thinking, which was that disaster was generous. The books were not fraudulent. She could see that immediately. There was no deliberate obfuscation, no attempt to conceal. They were simply the records of a man who was very good at ranching and very bad at accounting. Numbers ran in columns that didn't always add properly. Expenses were recorded in some months and not others. There were gaps that she could not immediately explain and totals that she was fairly certain were wrong. "I will need 3 days to get a full picture of where things stand," she told him. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I will also need you to answer questions as they come up. Some of this I cannot reconstruct without your input." "I will be available," he said. She believed him. There was something about Nelson Wells that was fundamentally believable. It was not a quality she had encountered often. She started with the most recent ledger and worked backward. It was the method she preferred. Understand where a business was now, then trace the history. She was meticulous and fast, moving through columns of figures with the fluency of someone for whom numbers were a native language. By the end of the first day, she had already identified 3 categories of error, all of them honest mistakes, and had noted them in a small book she kept for her own records. On the second day, she found something that made her stop. She was working through the quarterly tallies, cross-referencing the market sale records against the account balances, and there was a figure that did not belong. Or rather, it was not that it did not belong, it was that it recurred. Every quarter, without fail, a sum was recorded going out. The sum was not small. It ranged from roughly 40 to 60% of the net profit from each cattle sale. The entries were marked only with a set of initials in Nelson's cramped handwriting, VR Fund. She went back further. The entries went back 6 years, as far as the record she had been given reached. Every single quarter, without exception, VR Fund, and a figure that represented a substantial portion of what the business had earned. She sat with her pencil in her hand for a long time, doing the arithmetic. Over 6 years, at the figures she was reading, Nelson Wells had given away somewhere in the range of what would have been enough to triple the size of his operation. He could have bought more land. He could have increased his herd. He could have built a proper ranch house instead of the modest one she had glimpsed at the edge of the property. He had done none of those things, and the reason, apparently, was the VR Fund. She went on working, because it was not her place to ask yet. She needed the full picture first. On the third day, she put together the complete summary she had promised him. She walked from the office to the ranch yard where he was working with Hector on a section of fencing that had come down in a late spring storm. The afternoon sun was harsh and white, and both men were in shirt sleeves, working without complaint. "Mr. Wells," she called. "When you have a moment, I have completed my initial assessment." He drove one more post into the ground with the flat of a sledge, spoke briefly to Hector, and came to where she stood. He was dusty and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and he looked at her with the unhurried attention she was already beginning to recognize as simply his way. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. 14 minutes later, she heard him on the stairs. He had washed his face and hands and rolled his sleeves back down. He sat across from her at the small desk and looked at the papers she had laid out with the same steadiness with which he seemed to approach everything. She walked him through the errors, the corrections, and the true state of the accounts. She was thorough and clear, as she always was. She gave him the adjusted figures, the category of each discrepancy, and her recommended method for keeping the records going forward. He listened with his hands folded on the desk and asked two precise and intelligent questions that told her he understood everything she had said. Then she set down her pen and looked at him directly, because she believed in directness above most other professional virtues. "I also noted a recurring entry," she said. "The VR fund. It appears in every quarterly record I have. It is consistently substantial. I need to understand what it is in order to account for it properly." He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she could tell the difference by now just considering. "It is a private disbursement," he said, "not connected to the operational costs of the ranch." "I understand that," she said. "But for the books to be accurate, I need to know the source and purpose. If it is a charitable donation, it is recorded differently than if it is a debt repayment or an investment." He looked at her for a moment with something in his gray-brown eyes that she could not immediately name. "It is a charitable disbursement," he said finally, "to a specific fund. For families in the Paiute communities north of the county line. There was a period, several years ago now, when the resettlement policies left a number of families without adequate resources for winter. I established a regular contribution. I have maintained it." She kept her expression professional. Inside, something had shifted in a way she was not entirely prepared for. "I see," she said. "And the initials VR. Vasquez Reyes," he said. "Hector's cousin runs the distribution. He is trusted in the community and it keeps it from being public." He paused. "I would prefer it remain that way." "Of course," she said. "I will record it as a charitable disbursement, which it is, and I will keep the notation minimal. Your accounts will be accurate." "Thank you," he said. She nodded and looked down at her papers, and it was only then that she let herself think, very briefly, about what it meant. That this man had been quietly giving away half of what he earned, year after year, without telling anyone, without expecting recognition, in a territory where the injustice of how the indigenous peoples had been treated was acknowledged by almost no one and addressed by almost fewer. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. She thought about the desk positioned for the morning light. She thought about the precise, unhurried way he answered questions. She thought about a lot of things. But she was a professional woman in 1883, and she had not come to Dusty Creek to fall in love. She had come to do a job. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that she found, to her own surprise, deeply agreeable. She kept the books with the thoroughness she brought to everything, working mornings in the office, and spending her afternoons either reviewing the next quarter's projections or, increasingly, joining Nelson as he walked the grazing parcels or met with his trading partners in the county. He had begun including her in those meetings not as a courtesy but as a practical decision. He had told her plainly, if she understood the full scope of the business, she could keep better records. She agreed, and the invitations continued. She stood beside him at the negotiation table with the buyers from the Reno market and watched him operate with the same careful economy he brought to everything, never pushing when he did not need to, never conceding what was not necessary, always fair. Hector Reyes, who was a compact and observant man of 40 with a gray-salted mustache and a dry sense of humor that emerged in small, unpredictable moments, watched the two of them with an expression that Jennie caught twice and chose to ignore. The first time she and Nelson had a real conversation, not a professional exchange, but an actual conversation, was on a Wednesday evening in late June when a thunderstorm rolled in fast from the west and trapped them both in the trade office, because the gap between the building and the ranch house was running ankle-deep with water. She had been tallying receipts and he had been reviewing a supply order when the storm came, and they both looked up at the same moment, and then looked at each other with the mutual acknowledgement of people who were going to be staying where they were for a while. Margaret, the cook, had come through earlier that day and left a tin pot of coffee on the small stove. Jennie refilled her cup and, after a brief hesitation that she would not have admitted to, offered to refill his as well. He accepted. They sat on opposite sides of the room for a while with the rain hammering the roof, and then he said, without looking up from his supply order, "Where did you learn accounting?" "My father's firm," she said. "He had a practice in Memphis. I started helping him with the records when I was 12. 12, he repeated. "I was good with numbers," she said. "He was not by the end, so it fell to me." There was a pause. The rain made the lamplight feel closer, more contained. "Did you want to do something else?" he asked. "Other than accounting?" It was the kind of question that surprised her because almost no one asked it. What a woman wanted, professionally, was not a subject that arose often in her experience. She considered whether to give the polite, deflecting answer or the true one. "I wanted to read law," she said, "but that was not available to me." He looked up from his papers. His expression was not prying or patronizing. It was simply the expression of a man receiving information. "That is a loss," he said. "You would have been good at it." She looked at him. "You cannot know that." "I have watched you work for 6 weeks," he said. "You think in structure and precedent. You do not accept a number simply because someone wrote it down. You ask the precise question that gets to the center of a thing." He paused. "That is lawyering." She did not know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to being seen clearly by people she had just met, and she was not accustomed to being told what she might have been good at. "What about you?" she asked because the symmetry felt right. "I wanted to do exactly what I do," he said, and there was something very plain and settled about the way he said it. "I wanted land and cattle and honest work. I wanted to be a person who kept their word." "And the fund," she said, and then stopped herself. "I apologize, that is not my concern." "No," he said, and she expected him to leave it there, but he did not. "My father had a parcel of land in Texas that bordered Comanche territory. When I was young, there was a family. They came through our land during a very hard year, and my father refused them water from our well, sent them on. My mother cried for 2 days after, which was the only way I knew that she thought he had done wrong." He was looking at the supply order again. "The family did not make it to wherever they were going. We heard that later." The rain continued its heavy work on the roof. Jennie held her coffee cup with both hands. "I was 9 years old," he said. "I decided something that day. I did not want to be the man who had water in his well and sent people on. I have not always succeeded at it in every possible way, but I have kept the fund." "You have kept it for 6 years," she said. "I kept it in other ways before the fund was formalized," he said. "The fund began when Hector's cousin gave me a structure for it." She looked at him in the lamplight and the rain, this quiet man with his careful words and his unannounced generosity, and she thought, "I am in considerable trouble." She did not say that. She said, "I think that is one of the finest things I have ever heard," and she meant it as a plain statement of professional respect, which it was, but it was also something else, and she knew it, and she chose not to examine it too closely. He looked at her for a moment with something very still in his expression. "You are the first person I have told," he said. The words landed quietly, the way important things often did. She looked at him and he looked at her, and then the rain began to ease, and they both looked back at their papers, and neither of them said anything more about it that night. But something had changed in the room, and they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it, and that was its own kind of conversation. July came in hot and relentless, the kind of heat that made the hills shimmer and turned the creek to a reduced trickle. The cattle work intensified. The summer movement to higher grazing ground required all hands, including Nelson, who spent most of the daylight hours out on the range. Jennie kept the office, managed the accounts, and found herself, for the first time in her working life, enjoying her work in a way that had nothing to do with the numbers. She enjoyed the work because she understood it fully. Nelson had, without ceremony or announcement, begun consulting her on every operational decision that had a financial component, which meant nearly every decision. He would come in at the end of the day, dusty and tired, and she would have the numbers ready, and they would sit on opposite sides of the desk and talk through the next choice, whether to sell at the August market or hold for October, whether to extend the trade arrangement with the Kellerman Ranch, whether to invest in a second water well on the North Parcel. She was good at this. She was better at it with him than she had been at any previous job, and she knew why, though she would not say it aloud. She was better because he listened. He did not merely wait for her to finish speaking and then do what he had already decided. He heard her, weighed what she said, asked follow-up questions, changed his thinking when she gave him a reason to. It was the most intellectually satisfying working relationship of her life, and the fact that it was also becoming the most personally significant relationship of her life was something she was managing with the same methodical care she brought to the books. Hector noticed. Hector noticed everything. He said nothing directly for a long time, being a man of considerable tact, but in the third week of July he stopped by the office while Nelson was out and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that Jennie now kept brewing all day, and said, with great casualness, "Nelson has not brought anyone to the trading meetings in the 4 years I have known him. Not before you." Jennie looked at him over her ledger. "He brought me because I keep his accounts." "He has a very good reason for bringing you," Hector said agreeably, and sipped his coffee and left, and Jennie sat for a considerable time staring at her ledger without seeing it. She thought about what she knew of Nelson Wells, which was more than most people knew about a man after 6 weeks. She knew he was 32. She knew he had come to Nevada from Texas, and that the journey had not been without difficulty. He had mentioned, in the spare way he mentioned things, a cattle drive that had gone badly, a partner who had broken the agreement, a year in which he had nearly given up. He had not given up. He had rebuilt from a smaller base with a quieter determination. She knew he had no family nearby, a sister in Sacramento whom he wrote to monthly. Parents both gone, his mother to fever when he was 17, his father some years later, and she had gathered from the way he mentioned his father that there was a complexity there which he had largely made peace with but had not entirely forgotten. She knew he did not drink to excess, did not gamble, worked with his hands alongside his employees as a matter of both pride and practicality, and gave quietly and consistently to people who needed it because of a decision he had made at the age of 9. She knew that when he looked at her, he was actually looking at her, not through her, not at some idea of what a woman in her position should be, but at her specifically. At Jennie Crawford, who had wanted to be a lawyer and learned to be an accountant instead, and was very good at both of the ways in which they overlapped. She also knew, with the precision that she brought to all forms of assessment, that she was falling in love with him. The acknowledgement arrived in her chest like something warm settling into the right place, and she received it without drama, because she was a woman who had always been honest with herself even when she was guarded with others. She did not know what, if anything, he felt in return. The answer to that question came unexpectedly, on a Tuesday in early August, during what was meant to be a straightforward trip to the Kellerman Ranch to discuss extending the supply trade arrangement. They had ridden out together, Nelson on a dun quarter horse named Cairo and Jennie on a steady brown mare that the livery owner had declared completely trustworthy for someone who doesn't ride much, which was accurate as far as it went. The ride was 7 miles, through terrain that was brown and gold in the August heat, crossed by shallow arroyos and studded with the dark shapes of juniper trees. They talked about the trade terms on the way out, which was practical and correct. The meeting with old Ben Kellerman went smoothly. He was a gruff, leathery man of 60, who had initially looked at Jennie with the particular uncertainty of a man who was not accustomed to women at business tables, but who had thawed when she quoted him his own last year's numbers from memory without looking at her notes, which had the effect on Ben Kellerman that it generally had on skeptical men in business contexts. On the ride back, with the agreement confirmed and the afternoon cooling slightly toward evening, they were quiet for a while in the good way that people are quiet when they are comfortable with each other. "Ben approved of you," Nelson said. "I could tell." "He approved of the numbers," she said. "He approved of you," Nelson said again, and she looked over at him and found him watching her with a small, quiet smile that she had not seen on him before. It changed his face in a way that made her breath catch, which she handled by looking back at the trail ahead. "You have done very good work since you arrived," he said. "That is what you hired me for," she said, which was the safe answer. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it is. Though I will admit that the work is not the only thing He stopped. She waited. The horses moved steadily through the gold afternoon light. "I appreciate your company," he said carefully, "on these trips. In the office, I have found that He stopped again, and then seemed to make a decision and said, in the direct and honest way he said everything that mattered to him. "I have found that the days when we do not speak are noticeably different from the days when we do." She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her, and there was nothing evasive or ornamental about his expression. It was simply true, what he was saying, and he was saying it because he believed in saying true things. "I feel that as well," she said, because she had never pretended otherwise. He nodded once, and they rode the rest of the way back through the quiet Nevada evening, and when they reached the yard and he helped her down from the mare, one hand steady at her elbow, the brief warm weight of it, neither of them let go quite as quickly as they might have. Hector, who was crossing the yard with a saddle over one arm, did not comment, but he was smiling in the direction of the barn when he walked away. The weeks after that were a particular kind of sweet torment that Jennie had not experienced since she was a very young woman and had not, she was discovering, entirely outgrown. Everything between them was the same, the work, the meetings, the evening conversations over the account books, and everything was entirely different. She was acutely aware of him in the way you become aware of a particular sound once you have heard it. You cannot then unhear it. She noticed how he handed her things, papers, coffee cups, the occasional tool when she had taken to helping with small repairs around the office with a careful attention to not overstepping, not taking for granted, not presuming. She noticed how he listened when she spoke, with the full weight of his attention. She noticed, one morning when she arrived at the office to find he had put a small jar of fresh wildflowers on her desk, Nevada wildflowers, dry climate colors of yellow and pale lavender, that he was paying attention to her in the way that people do when they are thinking about you when you are not present. She did not mention the flowers. She looked at them for a long moment, and then she sat down and opened her ledger and smiled at the columns of figures in a way that would have been unaccountable to anyone who did not understand. The complication, when it arrived, came not from within but from outside, in the form of a man named Aldrich Brandt. Brandt was a cattle broker from Sacramento who had apparently done business with Nelson 2 years previously, before Jennie's time, and who arrived one afternoon in late August with 2 associates, a fine carriage, and the very specific energy of a man who believed that money excused most kinds of behavior. He wanted to buy Nelson's grazing rights on the north parcel. The offer he made, sitting across from Nelson in the trade office with Jennie at the small side desk where she customarily sat during business meetings, was generous enough that any reasonable man would have been tempted. Nelson listened to the full offer, asked 2 or 3 precise questions, and then said that he would need to consider it. Brandt, who had apparently not encountered much resistance in his business career, smiled in the specific way of men who believe that all resistance is theatrical and therefore safe to ignore. He then looked at Jennie, who had been quietly noting the terms as stated, and said, in a tone that was meant to be charming but was in fact dismissive, "I don't believe we've been introduced. Is this your girl, Wells?" The room went very quiet. Nelson looked at Brant with an expression that Jennie had not seen on his face before. It was not angry precisely. It was the expression of a man who had drawn a clear, bright line in a place where previously there had been no need for one. "This is Miss Crawford," he said, and his voice was exactly as even as it always was, which somehow made it more definitive. "She is my bookkeeper, and she is present in this meeting because she has a full understanding of the financials. If that is not comfortable for you, we can adjourn." Brant paused, recalibrated, and said with a broader, more accommodating smile, "Of course." "No offense intended, miss." Jennie looked at him without returning the smile. "None taken," she said, which was polite and also precisely untrue. After Brant and his associates had been shown out with a politely neutral commitment to follow up in the coming weeks, Nelson came back into the office and stood for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at her. "I apologize that you were spoken to that way," he said. "It is not your fault," she said. "It happened in my office," he said, as though that settled the question of whose responsibility it was. She looked at him. "Are you going to sell him the North Parcel rights?" "No," he said simply. "The money would allow you to substantially expand the herd," she said, because it was her job to say it. "I know," he said. "There are things I will not do for money, and selling that parcel is one of them. The North Parcel is the section closest to the Paiute communities. The grazing rights going to a Sacramento broker would not be good for the people who need that land buffer." He paused. "Also, I do not like him." She laughed, which was unexpected and genuine and seemed to surprise them both. His face opened into that quiet smile again, the one that changed everything. "I did not realize you were funny," she said. "I am occasionally," he said, and the smile stayed. She looked at him and thought, "I love you, you impossible, private, quietly decent man." And she did not say it because the time was not quite right and she knew the difference. But she held it like a thing of considerable value, carefully, because that was how she held things she did not want to drop. Brant's departure was not the end of it. It rarely was with men of his type. He came back 2 weeks later, this time with an offer that was not an offer at all but a politely worded threat. He implied, without stating directly, that he had connections with the County Land Assessment Board, and that the assessed value of Nelson's grazing parcels might change in ways that would affect his tax obligations. Jennie found out about this second visit because she was in the back of the office and Brant did not know she was there. She heard every word. She spent that evening at her desk working with focused urgency on something that was not the regular accounts. She pulled every record, the tax filings, the land assessments, the annual reports, the county ledger copies she had obtained when she first audited the books, and she built in her neat and irrefutable handwriting a complete and documented history of every assessment change on Wells' property over the preceding 8 years, with comparisons to neighboring parcels, with the county regulations cited by article and section. When she was finished, it was past midnight and the lamp had burned low. She set the document in the center of Nelson's desk where he would find it in the morning. He found it. He came and stood in the doorway of her office holding the papers and reading them with the precise attention he always brought to numbers, and she watched him and pretended to be working on something else. When he looked up, his expression was something she did not have a category for yet. It was past gratitude and not quite what she recognized as the other thing. "Jennie," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed between them with enormous weight and no sound at all. "This document," he said, "if presented to the county registrar before Brant makes any move, establishes a baseline that would make any attempt to retroactively reassess without cause legally untenable." "That is what it does," she said. "How long did this take you?" "That is not relevant," she said. He crossed the room and set the papers gently back on his desk and then stood looking at her with all that steady, unhurried attention that she had come to understand was the most sincere thing he did. "It is relevant to me," he said. "I know you did this last night. I know what last night's lamplight would have cost in time and in—" He stopped, started again. "I know what this cost you to do, and I want you to know that I see it, that I see you." She held his gaze, which was not always easy because there was something very direct and very warm in it. You once said that I was the first person you told about the fund, she said, because the memory had stayed with her. I think you meant that the way I understood it. Yes, he said simply. I would like to ask you something, she said, and I would like you to answer as plainly as you do everything else. I always will, he said. When you said that to me, she said, about being the first, did you mean only that I was the first person you had told, or did you mean something more than that? He was quiet for a moment, and she heard the weight of the question settling around them like the particular silence after a question has finally been said aloud. I meant, he said, that you were the first person I wanted to tell, that you were the first person about whom I had ever thought this is something she would understand. This is something she would hold correctly. He stopped. That is a different thing from simply being the first person who asked. She felt the warmth of that move through her the way warmth moves through a cold room when a fire is finally lit properly. Nelson, she said. Yes, he said. I am going to say something very direct. Please, he said, and there was something almost relieved in it. I came here to do a job, she said. I have done it well. I intend to continue doing it well, and in the course of doing it I have become, she stopped, gathered herself, continued. I have come to care for you a great deal, in a way that is entirely beyond professional. She kept her voice steady because she was a woman who had always delivered difficult truths with steady hands. I am telling you this because I believe in honesty, and because I think not telling you would be a kind of dishonesty I am not willing to practice. He crossed the small distance between them in 2 steps and took her hands, one in each of his, and held them with the same careful attention he brought to everything he valued. I have been trying to tell you something equivalent for the better part of 6 weeks, he said, and his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it, which meant it was the most serious. I have been doing a poor job of it. You have beaten me to the directness which I should have expected. She laughed, and he laughed too, and they stood in the small office with the morning light coming through the east window, and held each other's hands like people who had just arrived somewhere after a very long road. I am going to ask if I may court you properly, he said. I know it is old-fashioned, perhaps. It is exactly right, she said, because it was. Then I am asking, he said. Yes, she said. You have my very enthusiastic agreement. The autumn that followed was the most particular and treasured season of Jennie Crawford's life. Being courted by Nelson Wells was unlike being courted by anyone she had encountered before, which was not a large number but was large enough for comparison. He was attentive in ways that were thoughtful rather than performative. He asked about her, genuinely, and listened to what she said. He brought her books from the general store when the shipments came in, novels mostly, and one volume of law that she opened and read with a hunger that startled her, and that he watched with an expression of quiet satisfaction. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons when the work permitted, into the hills where the Nevada autumn turned the scrubland gold, and the sky was the particular wide blue that she had only found in the West. He told her things on those rides. Not in the compressed, careful way he told her things in the office, but more freely, as people do when they are moving through open country, and the horizon is very far away. He told her about the drive up from Texas, about the partner who had cheated him, about the year he had spent working for another man's ranch while he rebuilt his credit, about the particular morning when he had stood on the land that would become his with enough money finally in his pocket to begin, and had felt something that he could only describe as alignment, as if everything difficult had been in service of arriving at this specific place. She told him things, too. About Memphis and her father, about the years of quiet competence that had kept her family afloat while her father drank away his own recovery, about his eventual passing, and the fact that she had felt grief and relief in equal measure, and had spent a long time understanding that both of those things were allowed. She told him about Carson City, and the merchant who had been kind but whose business had collapsed just when she had begun to feel settled. She told him about the advertisement she had almost not answered, and the letter she had almost not sent, and the stagecoach she had almost not taken. "I am very glad you sent the letter," he said. "So am I," she said. He took her hand on those rides as a matter of comfortable routine, and she let it be a matter of comfortable routine, and that was the most natural and best kind of romance. In September, Hector's cousin Tomás Vasquez Reyes came through Dusty Creek for the first time since Jennie's arrival. He was a quiet man of about 45, compact and careful in his movements, with a face that held the particular dignity of someone who had navigated extremely difficult circumstances with integrity intact. He met with Nelson privately for an hour in the trade office, and afterward Nelson brought him to meet Jennie with a deliberateness that told her this meeting mattered to him. Tomás shook her hand and looked at her with the assessment of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. Then he said, in Spanish-accented English that was measured and precise, "Nelson tells me you know about the fund." "I do," she said. "He tells me you keep the records and keep the silence," Tomás said. "That is correct," she said. "Then you have my respect," he said with a simplicity that made the words weighty. He looked at Nelson. "She is good." "Yes," Nelson said, and the word carried more than its stated meaning, and Tomás did not miss it, and Jennie pretended not to notice any of this, which she was getting better at. After Tomás had gone, Nelson told her more about what the fund had actually accomplished over the years. It had helped 23 families through the worst winters. It had contributed to a small school that was now operating with 6 students. It had helped 2 young men travel to seek work when there was none in the immediate territory. It had not solved anything large or fixed any of the injustices that the federal policies had created. Those injustices were vast and systemic, and could not be solved by one man's quarterly contribution. But it had done specific, real good for specific, real people, and it had done so without any fanfare or credit or expectation of return. "I know it is not enough," he said, which was the most honest thing a person could say about a partial response to a large injustice. "It is something," she said, "and you have been doing it when no one was watching and no one knew. That matters." He looked at her. "You know now." "Yes," she said, "and I would like to ask, is there anything I can do with the books to make the distribution more efficient?" "There are ways of structuring it that would reduce the administrative friction and possibly allow for a larger effective contribution without increasing the gross sum." He stared at her. "You are thinking about the accounting structure of my charitable fund." "I am thinking about how to make it work better," she said. "Yes." He shook his head, and the expression on his face was somewhere between disbelief and tremendous warmth. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said, "and I think this is a worthy thing to be practical about." She restructured the fund accounting over the following 2 weeks, and the efficiency gains were not large, but they were real. And Nelson looked at the revised structure with the careful satisfaction of someone who had just seen something important treated with the respect it deserved. October arrived, and with it the autumn cattle sale in Reno, the larger of the 2 annual markets, the one that determined the shape of the following year's finances. Nelson took the drive to Reno with Hector and the hands, a 4-day journey with the herd. Jennie stayed in Dusty Creek to manage the office correspondence and had, for the first time since her arrival, 4 days of quiet in which Nelson was not present. She had not expected to feel his absence as much as she did. She worked efficiently, as she always did. She answered correspondence, she updated the trailing accounts, she made progress on the quarterly projections that he would need when he returned. She ate supper with Margaret in the kitchen, and found Margaret to be a dry and funny woman of 50 who had been cook at the Wells operation for 3 years, and who asked absolutely no questions about Jennie's personal feelings, which Jennie found both considerate and slightly suspicious. On the evening of the 3rd day, alone in the office with the lamp burning and the accounts done, she allowed herself to sit quietly for a while and think about what she wanted. It was a luxury she did not always permit herself. She was a practical woman, and practicality had carried her a very long way, But practicality alone had not told her, at 15, that she could want things beyond survival, and it had not told her, at 26, that she could want things beyond competence. She wanted this. She wanted this office and these books and this work and this town and this life with this particular man, and the want was clear and settled and enormous. She was not afraid of it. She had been alone long enough to know the difference between contentment and happiness, and she had been happy here in a way that she had not known she was missing until she found it. Nelson came back on the afternoon of the fourth day, road dusty and tired and carrying better news from the Reno market than he had projected. He came into the office and sat down across from her, and they went through the numbers, and when they were done and the result was clear and good, he looked at her across the desk and said, "I miss talking to you." "I miss talking to you too," she said. It was perfectly simple, the way true things tended to be. He asked her to marry him in November. He did it on a Sunday afternoon, on horseback, in the hills east of Dusty Creek, where they had ridden together many times, with the afternoon sky orange and gold behind him and Cairo standing very still as though even the horse understood the gravity of the moment. He did not make a long speech. He said exactly what was true, that he loved her, that she was the clearest and finest and most honest person he had ever known, that the life he wanted included her at the center of it, not as an ornament or a comfort, but as an equal in every sense, and that he would be very honored if she would be his wife. She looked at him for a long moment, this careful, decent, quietly remarkable man with his gray-brown eyes and his honest hands and his secret charitable fund, and she thought about the afternoon of the thunderstorm and the wildflowers on her desk and the way he said her name, and she said, "Yes, Nelson. With my whole heart, yes." He reached across the distance between their horses and took her hand, and held it, and they sat in the golden November light for a while before riding back. They were married in December, the week before Christmas, in the small Presbyterian church on the west end of Dusty Creek's Main Street. It was not a large wedding. There was no one to invite from Jennie's family side, her father being gone and her mother having died when Jennie was 3, and no surviving siblings. From Nelson's side, his sister Clara came from Sacramento, making the journey by stage, and arrived 2 days before the ceremony and stayed at the hotel, from which she descended each morning to the trade office to visit and to look at Jennie with an expression of frank appraisal that shifted, over the 2 days, into something warmer. On the evening before the wedding, Clara sat with Jennie in the back office over coffee and said, "He wrote to me about you in July. He does not usually write about people. He wrote 3 paragraphs. Jennie looked up from the ledger she was theoretically reviewing. "What did he say?" "He said you were the most competent person he had ever employed," Clara said, with a dry smile that was notably similar to her brother's, and that you had restructured his accounts in a way that was, I am quoting directly, elegant. He used the word elegant. She paused. Nelson does not use that word about horses or cattle or buildings or anything he builds with his hands, which are the things he cares about most. He used it about your accounting. Jennie felt a smile forming that she made no attempt to stop. He also said, Clara continued, with the careful tone of a woman about to say something important, that he thought he had found someone who understood him, not understood the business, understood him. She set down her cup. He has not said anything like that before, not about anyone. Jennie looked at this woman who shared Nelson's dark hair and steady way of looking at things and who had made a 2-day stagecoach journey to stand beside her brother on his wedding day, and felt something vast and warm in the middle of her chest. "I think," Jennie said, "that he understood me first, and that made it possible." Clara nodded, satisfied, and they finished their coffee in the good quiet of people who understood each other. The ceremony was brief and genuine. Hector stood with Nelson. Clara stood with Jennie. Margaret sat in the front pew with the 3 ranch hands and cried in a matter-of-fact way that suggested she had been expecting this for some time. Tomás Vasquez Reyes had ridden 2 days to be present, and he sat near the back in his good coat, And when Nelson and Jennie exchanged their vows, Tamaz pressed his lips together and looked at the front wall of the church with the concentrated expression of a man keeping his composure. Nelson's hands were warm when he held hers. His voice was even and clear and entirely certain. They moved into the ranch house, which was more spacious than Jennie had initially understood, 3 rooms downstairs and 2 above, built by Nelson's own hands over several years, solid and practical and filled with light. She brought very little with her materially, which Nelson had expected, but she brought her books and her ledgers and her writing desk, and she placed the desk in the front room by the east-facing window where the morning light fell. And Nelson saw her do it and said nothing, but went and got her a better chair from the storage room, a proper wooden chair with arms, which he had apparently been keeping. She looked at him and he looked at her. "You were saving that," she said. "I was saving it for the right use," he said, and she kissed him, standing in the morning light in their house with the Nevada sky enormous behind the window. Marriage with Nelson Wells was, she discovered, exactly what she had thought it would be and also considerably more. The work did not stop, it never would, and she did not want it to. She continued keeping the books, continued attending the trade meetings, continued building the fund accounts with increasing efficiency. But now the work was woven into the texture of a shared life, and the texture of that life was warm and full. He taught her more about the cattle operation, more than the numbers, more than the theoretical understanding she had built from the accounts. He took her out on the land and showed her what he saw when he looked at it, the quality of the grazing, the movement of the water, the signs in the cattle themselves that told you whether the herd was thriving or merely surviving. She received this knowledge with the same attention she brought to everything he offered her, and she began to see the land the way he did, slowly and partially, through his particular eyes. She, in turn, continued pushing the efficiency of the accounts in directions he had not considered. In the spring of 1884, she proposed a formalized partnership agreement with the 3 neighboring ranches that relied on the Wells supply trade, one that would give them a stable pricing guarantee over 3 years in exchange for guaranteed volumes. It was a structure she had worked out over the winter, quietly, in the evenings by the fire. When she put it in front of Nelson, he studied it for a long time, asked her careful questions, and then said, "This would give the smaller operations security they have not had before. That matters to me." "I know it matters to you," she said. "That is partly why I designed it this way." He looked at her across the table with that particular expression he had, not the professional attention, not the social attention, but the specific private attentiveness that was only ever directed at her, and said, "You are always thinking about what matters to me." "You do the same for me," she said, which was simply the truth. The partnership agreement was signed in May 1884, with all 3 neighboring ranches, and it changed the financial landscape of the small ranching community in ways that were immediately visible. Ben Kellerman told Nelson at the August market that it was the finest arrangement he had ever been party to, and he said it while pointedly looking at Jennie, which was its own kind of acknowledgement and better than she had expected from him. Their first child came in November 1884, a boy they named Henry James Wells, after both their fathers without Nelson's being fully explained, which Jennie understood and did not press. Henry was born with his father's gray-brown eyes and his mother's direct, focused gaze, and from the very first days he looked at the world as though he intended to take careful note of it. Nelson held him with the surprised, enormous tenderness of a man who has just discovered a previously unknown capacity for that kind of feeling, and Jennie watched him and thought her heart would not contain everything she was feeling, and decided that it would simply have to expand. The birth had been difficult 36 hours, and a doctor who had ridden out from Carson City and earned every cent of his fee. And afterward Jennie was tired to the bone for several weeks, and Nelson stayed close in a way that was not hovering but was present, always present, ready to be needed without requiring anything. Margaret took over the kitchen with fierce authority. Hector ran the operation without requiring direction. Clara wrote long, warm, practical letters from Sacramento that made Jennie laugh even when she was too tired to want to. By spring of 1885, the family had found its shape and it fit everyone in it. The fund continued. Jennie attended 2 of the distribution meetings with Tomás in the summer of 1885, something Nelson had asked hesitantly, and she had agreed to immediately. She saw, for the first time, the direct effect of what the fund did the school with its 6 students, now 8. The family whose winter stores had been supplemented, the 2 young men who had found work in Carson City and sent modest payments back. She shook Tomás's hand at the end of the second meeting and said, "I would like to suggest a structure for increasing the fund without increasing the quarterly outlay. May I send you a proposal?" Tomás looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "please." The proposal involved a modest investment in a cattle breeding arrangement that would generate additional income specifically designated for the fund, keeping it separate from the operational accounts. It required a modest initial outlay and a 2-year horizon before full return. Nelson approved it without hesitation. "This was your idea," he said. "It is your money and your fund," she said. "It is our money now," he said. She received that, let it settle, and then said, "Then yes, it was our idea," and he smiled in the way that still, after almost 2 years of marriage and 1 child and several hundred evenings of shared work and conversation, made the room feel different. In 1886, the fund's investment returned its first dividend. In 1887, it doubled. By 1888, the fund was large enough to endow the school permanently and still maintain the winter support program. And Tomás came to Dusty Creek specifically to deliver this news and to eat supper with the Wells family, Nelson and Jennie and Henry, who was now 3 years old and had recently developed strong opinions about what time supper should be served. And the supper was long and warm, and Tomás told stories about his family in a way he had never done before, which Jennie understood was a mark of genuine trust. The injustice was still vast. The government policies were still what they were. The land that had been taken could not be returned by a cattle rancher's quarterly contribution, however faithfully made. But what could be done was being done, and was being done better every year, and that mattered in the specific and real ways that things which are actually done matter. Dusty Creek changed in those years, gradually, and in the minor ways that small towns change. The hotel stopped listing to the left, its foundation having been repaired by a carpenter from Reno. The saloon acquired a new sign. It turned out to be called the Copper Kettle, which nobody had expected. A schoolhouse was built on the south end of the main street, and a new family arrived from Ohio with 5 children, all of whom enrolled immediately. Nelson's operation continued to grow, not dramatically but steadily. The partnership agreement Jennie had designed proved its value year after year. The north parcel, which Nelson had refused to sell to Aldrich Brant, turned out to have the best winter grazing of any of his parcels. And when Brant made one final approach in the spring of 1887, with an offer that was by then twice what it had been, Nelson said politely, and without elaboration, that it was not available. And Brant, who had by that point lost his land board connections to a scandal that Jennie had quietly anticipated based on the way he operated, had no recourse and went away for good. She had kept the assessment document. She had not needed it. But she had kept it, and she thought sometimes about the night she had built it, the single lamp burning, the knowledge that she was doing it for him, for this man she was falling in love with and did not yet have the right to say so. She thought about that Jennie Crawford who had been so careful and so guarded, and she felt great tenderness toward her. Henry acquired a sister in the spring of 1887. They named her Rose Clara, the Clara for Nelson's sister, who cried on the way home from the telegraph office when she received the news and told her husband she was not crying. She merely had something in both her eyes simultaneously. Rose was born with her mother's green eyes and her father's patience, and from the age of approximately 2 months had a way of looking at her older brother with the particular evaluating gaze of someone taking notes for future use. Henry, for his part, took his responsibilities as an older sibling with a seriousness that he seemed to have inherited from both parents simultaneously. The ranch hands came and went over the years with the natural rhythm of such things, but Hector Reyes stayed. He became, if such a thing was possible, more firmly embedded in the operation and the family, known to Henry and Rose as a man who mended fences and carved small wooden animals with equal skill, who had a story for every question a child could ask, and who was a reliable source of candy from the general store at intervals that suggested he had planned them strategically. Margaret stayed too, long past the years when she might have chosen otherwise. She claimed it was because the food she could make from the Wells kitchen garden was worth the ongoing employment, and this was plausible, though Jennie suspected it had more to do with the fact that Sunday suppers at the Wells house had become, over time, a gathering point for half the population of Dusty Creek, and Margaret had more genuine creative authority over those suppers than she would have had anywhere else. Sunday suppers had become a tradition that had started accidentally and become unshakable. It had begun when old Ben Kellerman had found himself without supper one Sunday after his cook left for Reno, and Nelson had suggested he come over, and then the Kellerman visit had been witnessed by Hector, who had mentioned it to the new schoolteacher, a woman named Harriet Vance, who had arrived from back east in the fall of 1886, and who was, Jennie had determined within 3 weeks of her arrival, one of the finest people she had encountered. Harriet had come the following Sunday and then the Sunday after, and by the third Sunday there were 8 people at the table, and by the third month there were 12, and Margaret had stopped being surprised by the numbers and simply started making enough for 15 as a baseline. Harriet became Jennie's closest friend, the kind of close that means you say the difficult things as well as the easy ones. Harriet understood the work of being a competent woman in a world that had not yet decided what to do with competent women, and she and Jennie talked about this with the free and honest language of people who trust each other entirely. Harriet had her own complexities and her own history, and she shared them gradually, as people do with people they trust. In the summer of 1888, something happened that Jennie had not expected. Harriet fell in love with Hector Reyes. She did not announce this. She did not need to. Jennie watched it happen with the same attention she brought to accounts, the gradual, undeniable accumulation of small evidence pointing to a large conclusion. The way Harriet looked for him when she arrived on Sundays. The way Hector, who was a man of habitual economy of expression, became oddly verbose in Harriet's company, telling stories with more detail than was strictly necessary. Jennie mentioned this to Nelson one evening in bed in the comfortable dark, speaking quietly so as not to wake the children. "I know," he said. "You know, Hector told me in April," he said. "He asked me how I had managed to speak directly about what I felt. I told him he should simply say the true thing." Jennie lay in the dark for a moment. "You told him what you told me." "I told him what worked," Nelson said simply. "Has he said the true thing to Harriet?" "Not yet," Nelson said. "He is working up to it." "I could encourage Harriet," Jennie said. "Or we could let it happen," Nelson said, with the even good sense of the person he had always been. It happened in September. The following Sunday supper had a particular glow to it that everyone present identified, and no one mentioned until Margaret, who had a specific tolerance for unspoken things, said over the dessert that it was very nice that Hector had finally gotten around to speaking his piece, and the table erupted into laughter, and Hector, who was red to the ears, looked at Harriet, and Harriet looked back with the clear-eyed certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she wants and has just gotten it. By the winter of 1889, the Wells children had become 6 Henry and Rose, and 4 Sunday supper regulars who were not Wells by blood, but who came every week and considered themselves part of the household in the particular way that children absorb warmth wherever it is genuinely offered. The schoolteacher's presence ensured that the Wells house was never short of improving conversations and improving opinions about the children's education, which Henry received with interest and Rose received with the skeptical intellectual engagement of someone who was going to be arguing with her teachers in class within the year. In the spring of 1889, Nelson was elected to the County Trade Council, a small and relatively unglamorous position, but one that carried the capacity to advocate for the interests of small ranchers and, crucially, for the broader community, including the Paiute families whose welfare the fund served. He took the position seriously and served on it without ceremony, bringing the same fair-minded and patient approach to its business that he brought to everything else. Jennie was proud of him in the way she was proud of him for the fund, which was to say, immensely and largely privately. He knew because she told him, in the direct way she told him everything. She said it one morning over coffee at the kitchen table, Henry and Rose not yet awake, the Nevada morning making the windows gold. "I am very proud of you, for the council, for the way you do things." He looked at her across the table with all of his unhurried attention. "Because of you," he said. "Not entirely," she said. "More than you think," he said. "You changed the way I understand what is possible. I was a good rancher before you came. I knew how to work and how to be honest. But you showed me," he paused, and she watched him find the words which he did not always find quickly. "You showed me that being good at the thing you do and being good to the people in the world are not separate problems, that they can be one project." She looked at him. This man who had been quietly giving half his profits away for 6 years before she ever arrived, who had positioned a desk for the morning light before he ever met her, who had kept his word through hard years and easy ones, who held their children with the enormous surprised tenderness of a man who had not known until it happened how much room he had for that kind of love. "Nelson," she said. "Yes," he said. "You were doing the good thing long before I arrived," she said. "You were the one who taught me. I only helped you do it better." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in the morning light while the coffee cooled and the children slept, and the Nevada sky outside the window went from gold to the clear, limitless blue that she had come to love the way she loved everything that had turned out to be more than she expected. The second son was born in November 1889, and they named him Thomas, after Tomás Vasquez Reyes, who received the news by telegraph and sent back a reply that consisted of 3 words: "I am honored." He came to Dusty Creek the following spring and held the baby with the practiced certainty of a man who had children of his own, and the school that the fund had endowed was, by that spring, operating with 14 students, and had just received a donation of books from a benefactor in Sacramento, Clara Wells, who had decided without being asked that this was a worthy project and had simply acted on that decision. The Wells family gathered at the Sunday table that spring with more people around it than had ever been there before. Nelson and Jennie, Henry at 6 and Rose at 4 and Thomas at 6 months, Hector and Harriet, now Harriet Reyes, having married the previous October in the same church where Nelson and Jennie had married. Tomás and his eldest daughter who had traveled with him. Ben Kellerman, who was by now a genuine friend rather than merely a business partner. Margaret, the schoolteacher who had replaced Harriet when she married and who had been absorbed into the Sunday gathering as though she had always been there. And 3 of the ranch hands with their families. It was too many people for the table. Nelson had brought in the extra plank from the barn, as he had begun doing weeks ago, and the table stretched the length of the front room. Margaret had made 3 kinds of bread and a roast and a bean stew and an apple cake that had arrived at the table to the kind of sustained collective reaction that made a cook feel that the world was in order. Jennie sat at her end of the long table and looked at all of it, the abundance and the noise and the warmth, the children and the old man and the newlyweds and the business partners and the trusted friends. And across the length of the table she found Nelson looking at her with the expression she knew better than any other expression in the world. It was the same expression he had worn in the lamplight on the night of the thunderstorm, when he had told her about the well and the boy he had been at 9 years old, and the decision he had made. It was the same expression he had worn on a Sunday afternoon in November when he had asked her to be his wife. It was the same expression he wore every morning when she sat down to her desk in the east window of their home, and every evening when the last lamp was turned low, and every quiet moment in between that was too particular and too theirs to be named for someone else. It was the expression of a man who knew exactly where he was and was entirely glad. She smiled at him across the long table full of people, and he smiled back, and Henry, sitting beside his father, tugged his sleeve and said loudly that he wanted more bread, please, which broke the moment into laughter, and Nelson tore the bread and gave his son the larger piece and looked back at Jennie across the noise and the warmth and everything they had built, and Jennie thought, this is it. This is the whole thing. This is what it turns out life can look like. If you send the letter, if you take the stagecoach, if you are honest when it is difficult and direct when it would be easier not to be. She thought about herself at 26 stepping off a stage in a small Nevada town with $4.32 and a letter from a man she had never met. She thought about the quiet office and the blank ledgers and the name that had meant nothing yet. She thought about the first entry she had found in those books, the VR fund, a recurring figure, half of what a man had earned, given without announcement to people who needed it, and about the question she had finally asked and the answer that had changed everything. She was the first, he had said. She was the first person he had wanted to tell. And she had been, she understood now, in every sense he meant and every sense he had not found words for yet. The first to know the full account of him, the first for whom the books had been opened completely. The first person who had looked at the numbers and understood not just what they meant but why he had given, why he had built, why he had waited, why the desk was by the window and the chair was in the storage room, and the wildflowers were in the jar on Tuesday morning without comment or ceremony, because he had been waiting for someone who would understand. And she had arrived, delayed one day by a stagecoach, and walked the length of a red dirt street in a gray traveling dress, and pushed open a door into a room that smelled of leather and pine resin and coffee. And the rest was the best accounting she had ever done, every figure correct, every column adding to the right sum, every balance exactly as it should be. Thomas Wells, at 6 months of age, had fallen asleep against his father's shoulder at the end of the long Sunday supper, his small face the perfect, unconscious expression of absolute trust. Henry was telling Tomas's daughter a very long story about a horse he had seen at the livery that he intended to own someday, and she was listening with the polite and slightly skeptical expression of a girl who is 2 years older and knows it. Rose had fallen asleep under the table, a habit she had developed at approximately the age of 2 and showed no signs of outgrowing. Hector was helping Margaret with the dishes. Harriet was in conversation with Ben Kellerman about what native plants did best in the dry Eastern Valley soil, which was apparently a subject of passionate mutual interest that no one had previously known they shared. The lamp on the long table burned gold and even. Jennie got up and went to Nelson and took Thomas gently from him and settled the baby in the crook of her arm, and Nelson looked at her in the lamplight with everything that had ever passed between them present in his face, and said, very quietly so only she could hear, "I would choose this every time, every single time from the beginning." She leaned against him, the sleeping baby warm between them, the sound of the house full of people around them. "So would I," she said. "I would send the letter every time. I would take every stagecoach." He put his arm around her, steady and sure. Outside, the Nevada night was clear and immense and full of stars, the same stars that had been there the evening she arrived, the same sky that had looked down on the red dirt street and the lopsided hotel, and the faded sign, and the trade office at the end of the block, the same sky that looked down now on a ranch house full of warmth and people, and the complicated, irreplaceable, fully accounted life that two honest people had made by being willing to tell the truth about what they were, and what they needed, and what they, against every reasonable probability, had found. Henry, at the far end of the table, had just gotten to the part of the horse story where he described the exact color of its mane, and Tomas's daughter, to her credit, was still listening. Margaret said from the kitchen that there was more apple cake, and was answered by a general sound of appreciation. Hector laughed at something Ben Kellerman said, a full laugh that Jennie had heard perhaps twice before, and Harriet looked at him the way people look at the things they love when those things are being fully and unself-consciously themselves. Rose slept under the table with the absolute serenity of a child who has been thoroughly loved and therefore fears nothing. And Nelson Wells held his wife in the lamplight, with his son asleep between them, in the house he had built with his own hands on land he had earned with 8 years of honest work, and every account was settled and every balance was right, and the morning would bring new work and new decisions and the ongoing good difficulty of a life worth living, and he was entirely, profoundly, completely at home. As was she.